Let's start with The Phantom Menace. I have a ton of nostalgia for this movie, and that absolutely shapes my opinion of it. This is the first Star Wars movie I ever watched, I believe. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I did not see it in theaters. I was only 3 years old when it came out. I do remember my dad coming home with the VHS and watching it shortly thereafter, and then I think I watched all 3 of the originals after that because I had watched all 4 before Attack of the Clones came out. I'm pretty sure this is the first one I ever watched, and I did like coloring books and I drew the characters. I was obsessed with this movie as a little kid. Now, it is certainly my least favorite of the prequels. I think it is definitely the weakest and most flawed of the 3. However, I also think it has a ton of merit and fits well within the trilogy and has a ton to offer for the larger story of the trilogy. Something that I have come around to a lot more as I have gotten older is the political aspects. As a kid, they didn't really bother me. As a teenager, I kind of hopped on to the bandwagon, started hating on the prequels and saying, oh, I hate all the political talk in The Phantom Menace. And literally, the first line in the opening crawl has to do with taxation of trade routes. And now, I almost like that stuff more than I like the action. Don't get me wrong. The best part of this movie is by far and away the final battle, which I will get to. But I have come to appreciate the political aspects significantly more throughout the years as I have gotten older and become a more political person myself. I think all of this talking, the Senate meetings and everything was incredibly compelling and extremely necessary to tell the narrative regarding Palpatine's rise to power. You have to remember that this was all his doing. He used the frustrations of the Trade Federation regarding the taxes to create this threat on Naboo, which he then used to sow mistrust and frustration in the Senate and Chancellor Valorum, which he then used to become Chancellor himself. The guy was playing 4D chess with himself throughout the entire trilogy, and it starts right away with this one. I love how we get both sides of the character in this movie. We get a good amount of both Senator Palpatine and Darth Sidious. Sidious especially, I think, has a really cool and interesting role in this movie. We get glimpses of him throughout the runtime, talking to the Trade Federation, giving them orders. And he's kind of this mysterious, looming presence throughout the movie, and he just oozes intimidation and screen presence. I mean, the first thing we hear from him is, I don't want this stunted slime in my sight again. I also love how the hologram kind of muffles his voice a little bit so that he sounds even more Emperor-esque, like begin landing ground troops. On the flip side, the first time we see Senator Palpatine is also in hologram form when he is talking to Queen Amidala, and he cuts out, and his voice gets kind of muffled, and it sounds very similar to the way Sidious's voice just sounded a couple scenes ago, and that is brilliant foreshadowing. I'm not entirely sure if everyone knew that Senator Palpatine was going to be the Emperor. I did because my parents did, and anyone who actually looked at the actors did. But I know there are a lot of people that actually didn't, so I'd be interested to know what people thought at this point of Senator Palpatine. But like I said, me and my family, we all knew from the jump, and just looking back on it, there's tons of brilliant foreshadowing, not just involving Palpatine in this movie, but also Anakin and the Jedi in general, and so many other things. I love how this movie gets to the action right away. Some of the Star Wars movies will wait a while before getting to any real action, in particular, lightsaber action. The lightsabers come out right away in this one, and they get to destroying droids, and I just thought that was so cool the first time I watched it. The Jedi in their prime, just destroying all these faceless, nameless enemies. Had a ton of fun with that. I also really love the standoff with the droidekas. I think that made perfect sense because the droidekas have those force fields that the Jedi can't penetrate, but they also can't move very fast when they're using those force fields, so they can't really catch up to the Jedi when they're running away without being in danger. So I thought that was pretty cool. Made a ton of sense. Right off the bat, we get lots more world building, and we get to see what things looked like pre-Clone Wars, and I appreciated that so much. I also just love all the sounds, the blaster sounds, the lightsaber sounds, and the different firing sounds that the droidicas made, and that is a very distinct sound. Sound is incredibly important in this trilogy, and that's something that I will come back to many, many times. Let me address the massive elephant in the room in Jar Jar Binks. I'm not going to say a ton about him in this video, and there's a reason for that. I don't blame the actor. I think the actor got way too much shit. Seems like a really cool dude. However, I will say this, because I'm focusing on the positive. I thought that Gungan City and all of that underwater stuff was really cool. Gungan City looked gorgeous. It's a cool idea. It's kind of like Star Wars' version of Atlantis. And I also really loved the creatures that were under there when they were going through, you know, up to Naboo the short way through the planet core, using the bongo and all those cool creatures and fish they ran into. Always a bigger fish. I don't think these movies get enough credit for being as quotable as they are. There are so many one-liners in this trilogy, such as the one I just mentioned, "There's always a bigger fish." You're right about one thing, Master. The negotiations were short. A lot of them admittedly come from Obi-Wan, but there are so many quotes from this trilogy that I use in everyday life. Of course, the big standout of The Phantom Menace is Darth Maul. He is just such a cool character. I love his look. Very creepy, almost like a horror villain. It's funny that the demon in Insidious actually looks just like him. And I love the first time he comes on screen and Sidious says, "Not for Sith." Such a great moment. He's got a really cool theme. It's not even really music. It's kind of just sounds. It's like whispers, like da, 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 whenever he's around. Love that. You can really feel his presence. And I think that not talking much worked very well for the character. I don't know exactly how everyone else feels about this. I know he talked a lot more in the Clone Wars, and that worked as well. But I think it was cool that he didn't. It felt more like a quiet assassin. He felt almost scarier that way. And, of course, have to give a shout out to Ray Park, who absolutely nailed all of the physical aspects of the character. Just incredible stuff. And because of him, we got probably the best live-action fight in Star Wars history. I also want to address one of the biggest criticisms of this trilogy, and this movie in particular, and that is Midi-chlorians. I was not a big fan of them, like most people. I have somewhat come around to them a little bit. I don't hate the idea that different people are more powerful in the Force than others, and that you can actually measure that. I understand why people don't like it, and I'm not sure that I love them. I get that it demystifies the Force. I understand all that. But I don't hate them as much as everyone else, and there's something that I have sort of come around to throughout the years. The pod race is pretty cool, maybe a little bit too long, but it is really enjoyable, and something that really stood out to me for the pod race was the sounds. The pod sounds were so cool, and I love how each pod sounded different. Sebulba's pod in particular sounded very distinct. Just thought that was so cool, and it was a very intense scene. We knew what was going to happen. We knew he was going to win, but it is just such an awesome scene to watch, especially if you have a big screen with surround sound. Just really, really hits. And like I said, sound is massive in these movies, and they elevate them so much for me. All of those cool Star Wars sounds, Lucas absolutely nails them. Let's talk about the man himself, or in this movie, the kid himself, Anakin Skywalker. And first of all, let me just start by saying, guys, I know the damage has basically already been done on this front, but leave Jake Lloyd alone. He did a good job for a kid, and it is really sad that his life was basically ruined from this movie. I can't believe people were treating a little kid that way. That is absolutely disgusting. Just wanted to get that out of the way. Now to talk about the actual character, and contrary to what a lot of people seem to believe for some reason, they planted the seeds for his turn very early. The first one was him not wanting to leave his mom. He was old enough to the point where he had become really attached to his mom, but not old enough to where he was ready to leave her, and that's why the Jedi usually take kids and train them when they're younger before they had formed any of these real attachments to people. So the fact that he has to leave his mom, then you have the council telling him that he might be the chosen one, but also they're not going to train him because they don't trust him and he's too old and he might turn to the dark side. Got all of this stuff rumbling around in this little kid's head that is just too much for him to take. And I'm not saying that the Jedi were wrong necessarily in this specific case. It's hard to say what would have happened if the Jedi didn't train him. I'm guessing Palpatine would have found him anyway and trained him anyway, so they were probably right to train him, and Qui-Gon was probably right that they should train him. But this was just a very unfortunate situation, and Palpatine knew this, and he preyed on it throughout the entire trilogy. This kid was full of insecurities, full of fear, full of emotions that he did not know how to deal with. And let's be honest, the Jedi handled him horribly. They could have approached this so much better and taught him a more constructive way to deal with his emotions instead of just forget about it, no fear, no attachment, none of that. That won't work. All that is going to do is make someone feel those emotions more and not know how to deal with them. And I just want to give a shout out to my guy Qui-Gon, because he was right about everything. And this is something that most people have seemed to agree on throughout the years. Look, it can be debated, like I said, whether or not the Jedi should have trained Anakin, but I think it was better to train him as a Jedi than to not. So I think that was the right direction to take, and I think if Qui-Gon had still been around to train Anakin and he had done so, I think everything would have turned out fine. I truly believe that. I think Qui-Gon was the right guy for it, and I don't think Obi-Wan was. And Palpatine, of course, got his claws in him right away. We will watch your career with great interest. I mean, he kept an eye on him the entire time, and everything played out exactly the way he wanted it to, and the Jedi just drove him right into Palpatine's hands. Qui-Gon talked ad nauseum about being in touch with the living force instead of the future and doing what's right regardless of the Jedi Code, and his criticisms of Jedi dogmatism. Their hubris shows in this movie when they dismiss the idea of the Sith being back, and you realize that this happened under their noses and they had no clue it was going on. They played a huge part in everything going wrong in this trilogy. And again, telling Anakin that fear is bad and will lead to the dark side, and just to not have it in the way that they did, is not helpful whatsoever. Lucas certainly did this on purpose. He knew there were problems with the Jedi, and that is brilliant storytelling. Now let's get to the fun part, the third act, and I really, really enjoy this finale. It's honestly one of my favorite finales in the Star Wars saga. I love how there's different battles going on. I think the space battle is pretty fun and reminiscent of the original movie. However, of course, the highlight is the lightsaber duel between Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon versus Darth Maul. What an incredible fight. It might be the best lightsaber fight of all time. I think it is certainly the best live-action lightsaber fight of all time. The only thing that would even compete with it for overall best, in my opinion, is the Anakin versus Asajj Ventress fight in the Clone Wars Micro series. But this is just incredible. The choreography is amazing, and I don't want to hear that it's over-choreographed. This is the Jedi and the Sith in their prime, and come on, it is so much fun to watch. Bray Park shines here. If it would have been someone else in this role, the fight wouldn't have been nearly as good. My mind was absolutely blown the first time I saw the double-sided lightsaber. I thought it was just so cool. The setting is constantly changing. The dynamics are constantly changing. Obi-Wan is knocked down, and then he gets separated from Qui-Gon, and he has to watch Qui-Gon die in an incredibly tragic scene. Then he comes in and fights Darth Maul by himself, which is just the coolest thing ever, cuts off half of his lightsaber, and defeats Darth Maul, even though Darth Maul had the high ground. By the way, with the criticism people have of the high ground thing, why could Obi-Wan kill Darth Maul and Anakin couldn't kill Obi-Wan? Well, first of all, Obi-Wan had experience in this regard. He knew what happens when someone gets cocky when they have the high ground and they're not prepared for someone to jump up towards them. He was completely prepared for Anakin. Darth Maul was thrown off by Obi-Wan jumping towards him, so it makes perfect sense for me. He was in shock. You could see it on his face. So to me, that criticism doesn't hold much water. Qui-Gon dies and has Obi-Wan train Anakin, which again, I think was a mistake. I think Qui-Gon was the right choice, and without him, someone else probably should have done it. I think Obi-Wan was too close to him in age. And we end with, of course, before the big final party scene, the ending as far as substance goes. We get the always two there are, a master and an apprentice. But which one was destroyed, the master or the apprentice? And they pan over to Chancellor Palpatine. Absolutely brilliant foreshadowing, and this is his first step to gaining full power over the galaxy. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the masterpiece that is Duel of the Fates. John Williams is always great, but he absolutely cooked with this one. This is one of my favorite pieces in a movie ever, and it might not even be my favorite piece in this trilogy. That's just how good he is. But Duel of the Fates absolutely elevates this fight scene. It would have been already great without it, but with it, it is just that much better. So overall, The Phantom Menace, while far from perfect, I think it has a ton to offer, especially when you look at it as like the first act of this trilogy. It is a very worthy inclusion.